On the walls of the Dendera temple complex, carved into underground crypt chambers dating to Ptolemaic Egypt around 50 BCE, sits a relief that traditional Egyptology classified for generations as exclusively mythological art. The image shows a large ovoid enclosure supported by a segmented pillar with a serpentine form extending through its interior from a lotus base. The textbook interpretation read it as symbolic representation of cosmic creation. The snake, a primordial deity. The entire scene, ritualistic allegory. Then engineers trained in electrical systems analyzed the relief as a blueprint rather than mythology. The measurements, the hieroglyphic material specifications, the spatial relationships between elements, everything mapped to the design requirements of a low-pressure electrical discharge device. Experimental reconstructions built from the relief's documented proportions functioned as working lamps. The relief occupies the southern wall of crypt number 5, beneath the main temple structure dedicated to Hathor, accessed through narrow corridors cut into bedrock. The crypts were restricted spaces controlled by the priestly class, their walls covered with reliefs depicting ritual objects and ceremonial implements. French archaeologists first documented the relief during systematic excavation of the Dendera complex in the late 19th century under Auguste Mariette and later Émile Chassinat. The visual composition remains consistent across multiple depictions in adjacent chambers. At center is an elongated ovoid enclosure, approximately 2 meters in length as represented on the carved wall, with smooth outer surface and sealed terminal end. The enclosure is hollow. Inside, a serpentine form emerges from a lotus flower at the base, curving upward through interior space toward the sealed terminus. Supporting the structure from below is a vertical pillar with segmented appearance, resembling stacked components rather than a continuous shaft. Traditional Egyptology identified this as a djed, the hieroglyphic symbol representing stability and associated with Osiris's backbone. Flanking the bulb are human figures in priestly garments, hands positioned at specific contact points on the structure. The postures are not worshipful. They suggest physical manipulation, steadying an object requiring careful handling. Adjacent hieroglyphic columns provide annotations whose meanings have been debated since initial translation. The traditional interpretation classified the scene as symbolic creation mythology. The serpent was identified as Harsomptus, a deity associated with solar emergence and life renewal, or as manifestation of the primordial serpent existing in pre-creation chaos. The lotus represented rebirth and the origin point of existence, a motif appearing throughout Egyptian religious art in contexts related to daily solar resurrection and cyclical Nile renewal. The Djed pillar symbolized Osiris and cosmic stability, the axis supporting ordered reality. The bulb enclosing the serpent was read as abstract representation of the cosmic egg or creation's womb, a gestation space for divine forces before material manifestation. This reading fit the broader framework of Egyptian religious iconography as understood by late 19th and early 20th century scholars. Egyptian temple art was known for dense symbolism, every element carrying mythological and theological layers requiring specialist decoding. The reliefs were not regarded as documentary records of physical objects, but as visual theology, communicating cosmological principles to temple initiates and providing permanent records of divine order. The Dendera relief, under this framework, depicted creation's moment rendered in mythological visual language, with no reference to any material world object or process beyond symbolic representation. The interpretation became consensus because it aligned with existing knowledge of Egyptian religious practice, required no explanation beyond established scholarly methods of mythological analysis and hieroglyphic translation, and because no physical evidence resembling the depicted object had been recovered from any archaeological site. Egyptian lighting technology, as documented in tomb paintings, architectural remains, and surviving artifacts consisted of oil lamps fueled by animal fat or vegetable oil, torches soaked in resin, and polished metal mirrors reflecting sunlight into interior spaces. No archaeological precedent existed for devices resembling the Dendera bulb structure. In absence of such precedent, the default assumption held that the relief was allegorical rather than representational. The scholarly context explains why this interpretation persisted. Egyptology as formal discipline emerged in the 19th century following the Napoleonic expedition and Jean-François Champollion's hieroglyphic decipherment in the 1820s. Early Egyptologists were primarily philologists and historians trained in text translation, dynastic chronology reconstruction, and religious literature interpretation. Their methodological toolkit decoded written language and situated it within Egyptian civilization's cultural and theological frameworks. They were not trained in materials science, engineering, or experimental archaeology. The questions they brought to evidence reflected their era's disciplinary priorities. When the Dendera relief was catalogued in the late 1800s, examining scholars worked with available tools. They had access to carved stone, surrounding hieroglyphic annotations, and the broader corpus of Egyptian religious texts providing interpretive context. What they lacked was reason to consider the relief as technical diagram. Nothing in their training or existing evidence suggested such reading was warranted. The gap between religious and engineering interpretations was not failure of intelligence. It was a gap between disciplines not yet asked to collaborate on identical material. No one with electrical engineering or materials science training had examined the relief as technical document rather than religious art. The religious-only reading held position in scholarly literature for over a century, appearing in encyclopedias, museum catalogs, academic monographs, and introductory textbooks. Repetition by authoritative sources gave it the weight of established fact. Questioning it required not just new evidence, but willingness to step outside the interpretive framework that had produced it. The reconsideration of the Dendera relief as potential technical documentation rather than purely symbolic art began in the 1990s when Austrian engineers Walter Garn and Peter Krasa, working independently of the Egyptological community, applied electrical engineering principles to analysis of the carved images. Their approach was methodological rather than speculative. They treated the relief as if it were a schematic diagram submitted for patent review, measuring each component's proportions, analyzing spatial relationships between elements, and comparing documented geometry to design requirements of known electrical devices. What emerged was not approximation, but precision. The bulb structure, when its dimensions were extracted from the relief and converted to functional specifications, corresponded to the aspect ratio and internal geometry of a gas discharge lamp designed to operate under low atmospheric pressure, with an electrode positioned at one end and a conductive path extending through interior volume toward a sealed terminus. The technical matches were specific and cumulative. The ovoid enclosure that traditional Egyptology had interpreted as cosmic egg or symbolic womb had proportions of a vacuum chamber or low-pressure envelope, with length-to-width ratio consistent with designs intended to maximize electrical arc path length while maintaining structural integrity under partial vacuum conditions. The smooth outer surface and sealed end indicated airtight construction, necessary to maintain reduced pressure inside the chamber and prevent atmospheric gases from interfering with discharge process. The serpentine form inside the bulb, previously read as deity Harsamtus or primordial chaos serpent, matched the visual appearance of an electrical arc or plasma filament as it would appear to an observer watching a discharge lamp in operation. The path of an arc through rarefied gas is not straight. It curves and branches in response to ionized particle distribution in the medium, producing a sinuous, snake-like trajectory that ancient observers would have no conceptual framework to describe except through analogy to living creatures or divine manifestations. The lotus base from which the serpent emerged corresponded in both position and function to an electrode housing. Hieroglyphic annotations adjacent to the lotus in several relief versions reference metal, specifically copper, and describe the lotus as an opening or aperture through which something enters the enclosed space. In the context of an electrical discharge device, this description aligns with the electrode's role as entry point for electrical current into the arc chamber. The lotus shape itself, with layered petals opening outward, resembles the flared or stepped geometry used to distribute electrical charge across a broader surface area and reduce risk of localized overheating or material failure at the point of current injection. The jed pillar supporting the bulb from below, traditionally interpreted as Osiris's backbone and symbol of cosmic stability, matched structural and material requirements of an insulator column. The pillar is depicted with a segmented or stacked appearance, as if composed of multiple discs or rings separated by gaps. This construction is consistent with high-voltage insulator design, which uses alternating layers of conductive and non-conductive materials or air gaps to prevent electrical current from traveling down the support structure and discharging into ground. Hieroglyphic texts associated with the DJED and Dendera context describe it as made from stone or stone-like substance, providing non-conductive properties necessary to isolate the bulb apparatus from the base and prevent short-circuiting during operation. The DJED's position directly beneath the bulb, bearing the structure's weight, matches an insulator's role as both physical support and electrical barrier. The human figures flanking the bulb and holding it at specific points corresponded to operational requirements of a device needing manual positioning or stabilization during use. The contact points shown in the relief are not arbitrary. They are located at structural stress points where the bulb would require reinforcement to prevent flexing or breakage, and where human hands could safely make contact without interfering with electrical components inside the chamber. The figure's postures, with arms extended and bodies braced, suggest the object had weight and required careful handling, consistent with functional apparatus constructed from materials such as copper, stone, and blown or cast quartz rather than purely symbolic representation carved from wood or molded from clay for ceremonial display. The engineering analysis moved beyond visual interpretation to experimental validation. Researchers constructed physical replicas of the device based on proportions and component specifications documented in the Dendera relief. Materials used in reconstructions were limited to those known available in Ptolemaic Egypt based on archaeological record of metallurgy, glassworking, and chemical knowledge. Copper was used for conductive elements, as Egyptian metallurgical expertise in copper extraction, casting, and alloying was well established by the first millennium BCE. Quartz, or similarly translucent minerals, were used for bulb enclosure, as evidence of quartz working and glass-like material production exists in Egyptian archaeological contexts dating to the New Kingdom. Electrolytes were prepared from naturally occurring acidic solutions documented in Egyptian texts, including vinegar from fermented grain, citric compounds from fruit, and saline brines used in mummification and textile processing. When replicas were assembled and activated using simple galvanic cells constructed from copper plates, zinc or iron separators, and acidic electrolyte solutions, the devices produced visible light through electrical discharge. The light was not intense by modern standards, but sufficient to illuminate small enclosed spaces such as temple crypts or ritual chambers where oil lamps would have produced excessive smoke and consumed oxygen in poorly ventilated environments. The arc path inside the low-pressure chamber followed the same curved, branching trajectory depicted in the Dendera relief, confirming that the serpentine form carved into stone was not metaphorical, but observational, a record of what the device looked like during operation. The fit was exact. Chemical and metallurgical evidence supporting the functional interpretation extended beyond the relief itself to the physical context in which it was found. Residue analysis conducted on floors and walls of Dendera crypts detected trace concentrations of copper salts, including copper sulfate and copper chloride, compounds that form as byproducts of electrochemical reactions involving copper electrodes immersed in acidic or saline solutions. These residues were not uniformly distributed across the temple complex. They were concentrated in crypt chambers where bulb reliefs appeared, and were absent or present only at background levels in adjacent storage rooms and corridors, showing no evidence of electrical apparatus in their iconography. The spatial correlation between chemical traces and relief locations suggested the chambers had been used for activities involving copper-based electrochemical processes rather than purely ceremonial functions. Metallurgical examination of copper artifacts recovered from temple contexts at Dendera and other sites with similar iconographic programs revealed wear patterns inconsistent with the tool's presumed functions as implements for stoneworking, woodworking, or textile production. Some copper tools showed pitting and corrosion localized to specific surface areas, consistent with exposure to electrical arcing, or prolonged contact with electrolyte solutions under conditions accelerating oxidation. Other tools displayed erosion patterns along edges and surfaces not corresponding to mechanical abrasion, but resembling material loss occurring when metal is subjected to sustained low-level electrical discharge. These patterns were not universal across all copper artifacts from Egyptian sites, but appeared with statistically significant frequency in temple contexts, associated with crypts, sealed chambers, and restricted access areas where priestly activities occurred away from public view. The Dendera relief was not an isolated case. Other temple complexes across Egypt contained similar imagery in contexts paralleling the Dendera crypts. At the Temple of Hathor at Philae, reliefs in underground chambers depicted bulb-like structures supported by jed pillars with serpents inside and priestly figures in handling positions. At Karnak, inscriptions in restricted sections of the Amun temple complex referenced divine light requiring metal and stone in precise arrangement, phrasing catalogued as purely metaphorical until the Dendera analysis provided framework for reading it as technical instruction embedded in religious language. Textual references in papyri to sacred serpents requiring metal and stone in precise arrangement, previously dismissed as allegorical, acquired new interpretive possibility when read alongside the physical evidence from temple sites. The question that followed from this accumulated evidence was not whether the Egyptians possessed electrical knowledge, but why such knowledge would be encoded within mythological narrative rather than transmitted through secular technical manuals. The answer required understanding that Egyptian knowledge transmission did not separate religious and technical domains the way modern Western scholarship does. The priestly class controlled both ritual and practical knowledge. Encoding functional information within mythological frameworks served dual purposes. It restricted access to dangerous or valuable techniques to initiated specialists who had undergone training in both symbolic interpretation and practical application, and it provided protective obscurity, preventing misuse by untrained individuals who might access the visual records without understanding the operational requirements and safety protocols the imagery encoded. Comparative evidence from other ancient cultures supports this interpretation. Greek fire formulas were transmitted through restricted military channels and encoded in deliberately obscure language. Damascus steel production techniques were guild secrets transmitted orally within family lineages and lost when those lineages dissolved. Roman concrete recipes capable of producing material that hardened underwater were encoded in technical vocabulary accessible only to trained engineers and were lost with the collapse of centralized Roman building programs. The pattern repeats across civilizations. Technical knowledge of significant value or danger was not broadcast publicly. It was restricted, encoded, and controlled by specialist institutions. The resistance to the functional interpretation of the Dendera relief from segments of traditional Egyptology rests primarily on absence of large-scale infrastructure. Critics argue that if Egyptians possessed electrical knowledge sufficient to design discharge lamps, archaeological evidence should exist for sustained electrical generation systems, power distribution networks, and widespread application of the technology across domestic and monumental contexts. The counterargument challenges the assumption underlying this objection. Modern electrical infrastructure operates at city and national scales because modern societies require continuous high-volume power distribution for industrial and domestic consumption. Ancient Egyptian society had no such requirements. If electrical devices existed, their function was likely localized, ceremonial, small batch, never intended for mass distribution. The technology may have served demonstration purposes in temple rituals, provided controlled illumination in sealed chambers for specific priestly activities, or functioned as proof of concept for principles that were understood theoretically but not scaled practically due to resource constraints or institutional priorities. The corrected understanding does not replace the religious reading. It completes it. The Dendera relief was both ritual object and functional device. The myth encoded the manual. What this reveals about Egyptian knowledge is specific. They possessed understanding of electrical principles, charge, discharge, insulation, conductive paths, sufficient to design working apparatus. Knowledge was transmitted through priestly lineages, encoded in iconography, and lost when those lineages dissolved during Roman conquest, Christianization, and the systematic destruction of temple libraries and institutional continuity that had maintained specialized knowledge for millennia. The mystery is no longer whether they knew. The mystery is how the knowledge was lost and what else was encoded in reliefs, papyri, and temple layouts that modern scholarship has not yet learned to read because the disciplinary tools required to decode it have not been brought to the material. The Dendera light was never just a religious symbol. The relief remains, carved into stone, waiting for the next set of questions trained eyes will bring to it.